Greetings, saints of the Most High. Welcome to another installment of the Messianic Torah Observer. Rod Thomas coming to you on a gorgeous Shabbat afternoon here in the DFW. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to fellowship with me on this glorious day of rest in Yeshua Messiah. And as always, beloved, it is my hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of TMTO finds you, your families, and your fellowships well and blessed. As I am publishing this discussion, it is the 5th day of the second biblical month of Yah's sacred calendar year, 6025, which translates to Shabbat, May 3rd, 2025. This is Did John Baptize Yeshua into the Melchizedekian Priestly Order? Part 5 of our Melchizedek series. We'll be picking up where we left off in Part 4 of our series discussion. Jewish folklore or tradition paints the Melchizedekian Priestly Order within the framework of the Hebrew patriarchy as we've seen, with the mysterious school of the prophets being somewhat of the diploma mill, if you will, that kind of spits out Melchizedeks every generation or so. But as we've also seen throughout this series, beloved, the canon of Scripture in no way supports this story. Our Bibles don't. The Genesis chapter 14, verses 17 through 21 account is concise, and it leaves no actual room for the idea of Avram's or Abram's Melchizedek being Shem, Noah's righteous son, and that this individual, this Melchizedek, is also running a so-called school out of his house or whatever. It seems logical, at least to me, that Moshe, the one whom we believe penned the book of Genesis, Bereshit, would have simply named the Melchizedek instead of inserting such confusion and uncertainty into the story. I held from the very start of this series that this mysterious unnamed man, Avram's Melchizedek, was a chosen soul of El Elyon, Yehovah, who had no familial connection to Avram at all. Now, if you've heard any of Jasher or Yashar, or if I should say if you've ever read it instead of heard it, you may have heard the recordings of it, but if you've ever read any of Jasher, you might recall that Avram's father sent Avram to live with Noah, or Noach, and Shem in order to escape the wrath of Nimrod, who sought to kill him. And thus, Avram would have been a student of the school of prophecy run by Noah and his son, Shem. But it wasn't until Avram's victory over Kedorlaomer's hordes that Shem, according to tradition, that the Melchizedek of the Genesis 14 account recognized. He recognized that Abraham was the next designated Melchizedek in a patriarchal line. And thus, the Melchizedek's and Avram's fortuitous meetup in the Valley of the Kings was more of a coronation, if you will, than it was a blessing in celebration of Avram's victory over Kedorlaomer. Imagine that. A coronation. Interestingly, neither the book of Jubilees or Yovelim nor the Genesis account make any such connection between Shem, Avram, and the Melchizedek. Philo, a Hellenist Jewish philosopher and historian, I should say, mentions Melchizedek in his writings. And I'll have the actual reference to that writing in the show notes for you if you're so interested over at the MessianicTorahObserver.org. But Philo primarily mentions Melchizedek in terms of tithing, and he makes no connection to Shem or any of the Hebrew patriarchs to the Genesis 14 Melchizedek. Then we have Josephus, the first century Jewish historian to Rome, who fingers Melchizedek as a Canaanite priest of God Most High in his writings Antiquity of the Jews. Josephus mentions nothing more, nothing less about the man. But there remains this obscure folklorish tradition in certain ancient Jewish circles that the Genesis 14 Melchizedek was Shem, one in a line of righteous individuals holding the dual office that can trace its origin back to Adam, and then on down to Jacob. Interestingly, this tradition adds another office to the Melchizedekian order, that of prophet. And so it goes that it was Jacob, while on his deathbed, amid him conferring his patriarchal blessings upon his 12 sons, that the Melchizedekian order was decentralized into 3 separate offices of prophet, held by the son Joseph, king, held by the son Judah, and priest, held by the son Levi. Now, despite the sketchiness of this tradition, this breaking up of the Melchizedekian order into now 3 offices, we know that the whole Melchizedekian order ultimately leads to and reaches its greatest potential in the person and ministry of Yeshua Messiah. So, biologically, Yeshua was of the royal Davidic line of the tribe of Judah. However, from a Hebrew or Jewish perspective, Yeshua, because he was not of Levitical lineage, could not hold a priestly office. And we're going to get way deep in the woods on this tonight, brethren, about this whole priestly progression in the Melchizedekian order as it touches upon the Levitical. It gets a little convoluted, but you'll see as we go along. And there are, of course, no impediments biologically of him, Yeshua, holding a prophetic office. And we know from the gospel records, Yeshua was the greatest of all Hebrew prophets. But there remains in the minds of some Jews the impediment of Yeshua not being qualified to be a priest. And so he could not step fully into the Melchizedekian order absent the priestly office. Now, that's all understandable if you were looking at this thing from a Levitical perspective. To look at this conundrum of Yeshua filling a priestly role under the Melchizedekian order, but not being a Levite or of Levite lineage, is to limit Jehovah's purpose, to limit Yah's plan and his sovereignty. And as I mentioned in previous installments to this series, Jehovah chooses those whom he desires to work with. Jehovah chooses those whom he desires to work with. All this talk of Avram's Melchizedek being Shem aside, Jehovah established, Jehovah cut, if you will, a covenant with Abraham. It was through this covenant arrangement that Jehovah's name would be propagated throughout the earth and humanity given the opportunity for salvation. Amen and amen. But on the flip side, clearly Jehovah had at least one other substantive relationship, possibly others, with an individual whom he elevated to the office of King of Salem, or King of Jerusalem, to be his duly chosen priest. And as I also previously argued, this individual who Moshe identifies only as Melchizedek had to have other souls who worshiped and feared Jehovah. For you can't be a true priest without individuals to serve or to intercede and teach. And there didn't need to be any familial connection between these two men of Jehovah. We've established that in the previous 4 installments. So let's look at the Melchizedek Levitical merging, or proposed merging of the Melchizedekian and Levitical orders. Was there a merging or coalescing of the Levitical and Melchizedekian priestly orders, as Dr. Ken Johnson, in his book on Melchizedek, seems to suggest? Was the Melchizedekian order that preceded the Levitical order split into 3 separate offices? Again, the priestly, the kingly, and the prophetic by the patriarch Jacob or Jacob. And that with the person and ministries of Yehoshua, all 3 offices are brought together and embodied by one individual. Although Dr. Johnson makes a slightly fair case for a merging of these 2 orders and a splitting of the Melchizedekian order into 3 offices, there is no canonical basis for such thinking. Even the apocryphal and Talmudic references provide little in the way of proof of such a merging or consolidation of these orders. Let's talk about the Melchizedek, John the Immerser, or John the Baptist, Yeshua connection. The Melchizedek, John the Baptist, Yeshua connection. We are progressing towards the ultimate association and connection that exists between the Melchizedekian order and the person and ministry of the Mashiach, the Messiah. But as you no doubt have seen over the course of these last 4 series installments, the road from Avram's Melchizedek, as recorded in Genesis 14, and the ultimate embodiment of Melchizedek in the person and ministry of Yehoshua, Messiah, references to Psalm 110, verse 4, Hebrews chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, Hebrews chapter 6, verse 20, and Hebrews chapter 7, verses 3 to 21, well, it's a complex. It's an elusive road, to say the least. And despite that elusiveness, there is indeed a connection between Melchizedek and Yehoshua, and maybe even a connection with John the Baptist or John the Immerser, Yochanan the Immerser. Let's look at Yeshua's royal pedigree. Scripture tells us that Yehoshua was a descendant of the Davidic royal line. Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 16. Now, the problem with Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 16, according to the received text, is that Yeshua's royal pedigree is assigned to him through his biological stepfather, Joseph. And I don't know about you, beloved, but for me, that recorded history or genealogy doesn't seem to cement the master's eligibility to sit on the throne of David as the prophet had previously foretold. Certainly, a weak pedigree coming from Matthew's testimony. And Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Yeshua, who is called the Christ. Matthew chapter 1, verse 16. So I ask you, looking at Matthew chapter 1, verse 16, how does Yeshua qualify to sit on the throne of David if his royal pedigree is through his adopted father Joseph? Indeed, the master's true father is Jehovah, Elohim. And yes, Joseph, Yehoshua's stepfather, according to Matthew's record, seems to be the one who is biologically descended from King David, along with Yehoshua's mother, Mary or Miriam. But again, why is Matthew focused on Joseph's lineage when Matthew himself meticulously avoids mentioning that Joseph fathered Yeshua? Shouldn't Matthew's focus be on certifying Yeshua's royal lineage through his mother, Miriam or Mary, since the master had no human father but only a human mother, who herself is descended from David? One would think so, right? There is another genealogy for the master in the apostolic writings. Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 38. Here, the genealogy recorded for the master is like that recorded by Matthew. Matthew and Luke's genealogy attempt to show Yeshua's Davidic pedigree through his stepfather Joseph. But there is a major difference between the two lines for the one who does their homework. Luke records the following lineage. Again, Luke chapter 3. Verse 23 reads, when he, the he being Yeshua, began his ministry, Yeshua himself was about 30 years of age. 30 years of age in the Hebraic sense from Torah is the age in which a Levitical priest would begin full-time service and ministry. So when he, Yeshua, began his ministry, Yeshua himself was about 30 years of age, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph, the son of Eli. And then we jump down to verse 31, Nathan, the son of David, on to verse 32, the son of Jesse. There are two areas of this genealogy to pay attention to here. A, Yeshua, the supposed son of Joseph, supposed son, who was the son of Eli. Supposed is indicating he was the stepfather. However, it was given over to him that he was the adopted son of Joseph. And then B, Nathan, who was the son of David. Now, let's look at a critical segment of Matthew's genealogy. Matthew chapter 1. Let's look at verse 6. And Jesse was the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Skipping down to verse 16. Still in Matthew 1. And Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Yeshua was born, who is called Messiah or Mashiach. As in Luke's account, there are two critical areas of Matthew's genealogy to pay attention to. A, David was Solomon's father. And B, Jacob's or Jacob's father was Joseph or Joseph, Miriam's husband's, Yeshua's stepfather. From these two critical pieces of genealogy, we can distill down three vitally important considerations regarding the master's Davidic pedigree. One, Luke's genealogy runs through David and his son Nathan, while in Matthew's record, the genealogy runs through David and his son Solomon. Now, the problem with these two disparate lines is that one line would qualify Yeshua to sit on his biological forefather's royal throne, supposing he qualified being Joseph's stepson, which we will discuss further in just a moment, while the other line makes him, Yeshua, again through his stepfather Joseph, just a descendant of King David, but would not qualify him to sit on David's throne. Matthew's record has the line going through King Solomon, who succeeded his father to the throne, while Luke's record, on the other hand, has the line going through Nathan, indeed a son of King David, but Nathan did not ascend to his father's throne. Thus, Matthew's line is the qualifying Davidic pedigree that would make Yeshua eligible to sit on his forefather's throne, but with one remaining impediment. Joseph was not Yeshua's natural father, which would shed a modicum of doubt as to the master's rightful claim to his biological father's throne. Nevertheless, there are some scholarly types out there that insist the focus on the master's stepfather, Joseph, should not be a showstopper. Should not be a showstopper for his claim to the throne of David. These claim that a Jewish son who is legally adopted possesses all the rights and all the privileges that come from that stepfather's line. And so this human legal technicality should silent any doubts as to Yeshua's right to the throne of David. But these scholars think that Jewish customs and traditions trump the legal requirements of the court of heaven. And the reality of the matter, beloved, is that human traditions and customs do not trump the legal standings of the court of heaven. Indeed, the enemy would know this, and the enemy would seek to capitalize on this conundrum of Yeshua, not biologically qualifying to sit on David's throne, which he has successfully resorted to throughout the ages. Look, our Jewish cousins recognize this problem in Yeshua's lineage, and thus many reject Yeshua as Messiah because he does not qualify to be a true son of David. He does not qualify to ascend to David's throne based upon these two genealogies as recorded in the Holy Writ or recorded in the Bible or in the canon of Scripture, however you describe the Bible. Then, of course, there is the issue of Nathan in Luke's genealogy. Joseph would be considered a descendant of David through Luke's genealogical record, but not of the royal line for obvious reasons. Again, the enemy has capitalized on this nuance as well. So, the second consideration is that Joseph could not have two forefathers. Have you noticed that? That Yeshua's stepfather, Joseph, is given two forefathers. Oh, and he's also given two biological fathers. The forefathers being Nathan and Solomon. Oh, and the two biological dads, Eli and Jacob. These inconsistencies muddy the Davidic pedigree of Yeshua even further. And the billion-dollar question demanding an answer, beloved, is, was Nathan or Solomon Joseph's true forefather? And was Eli or Jacob Joseph's true biological father? One lineage is likely the correct one, while the other one is not. Unless it should be noted that both genealogies mention Miriam, Mary as Yehoshua's biological mother, and Joseph as her husband. Is it possible, beloved, that one of these genealogies belongs to Miriam, while the other belongs to Joseph? And the answer to that trillion-dollar question is a resounding yes. Ding, 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 ding. Tell them what they won, Bill. We can't, without much difficulty, establish the truth of this genealogical conundrum unless we challenge the age-old, deeply entrenched belief in the Greek supremacy of the apostolic scriptures. Now, most of us grew up being indoctrinated into Christianity's assertion that the original autographs, or the original manuscripts, if you will, were drafted by their respective writers in Koine Greek, ancient Greek. Well, Koine Greek, ancient Greek, biblical Greek is, like Latin, dead language. And to our knowledge, there are no original manuscripts or transcripts of the apostolic writings. No original autographs. So what we have today are copies of Greek manuscripts that have undergone, no doubt, many alterations. And translators and copyists have used these altered manuscripts, that's me saying this now, to provide us with our present-day English versions of the apostolic writings in our Bibles. Turns out the oldest known New Testament manuscript is papyrus number 90, which contains words from the Gospel of John and dates back to the 2nd century. However, there are even earlier fragments, such as portions of the Gospel of Matthew and the book of Revelation, which some scholars believe could date to the 1st century. The Codex Vaticanus, a parchment manuscript from the 4th century, is one of the most complete early versions of the New Testament. It played a significant role in shaping modern scholarly editions of the Greek texts. But this is all about the Greek supremacy group. Those that strongly insist that the New Testament was written only in ancient Greek with a few Aramaic exceptions. And these have fought vociferously over the centuries to hide the fact that much of the apostolic writings were originally written in Hebrew. Unfortunately, like its ancient Greek counterpart, there exists no existing Hebrew manuscripts, original manuscripts, I should say, of the apostolic writings. They don't exist. They are probably all disintegrated by now, or they were destroyed. Who knows? All we have to support this idea that most of the apostolic writings were originally penned in Hebrew is circumstantial evidence and, frankly, historical common sense. Historical common sense from the perspective that all the New Testament writers, except for Luke, were Jewish. These 1st century Jews no doubt spoke Hebrew, and possibly, I will say, Aramaic. And so it is unlikely that they were experts in Koine Greek, despite scholars' pushback on this common sense historical reality. Did they know Greek? Koine Greek, whatever? It's possible they knew some, but enough to write the Gospels? Enough to write the epistles? I have serious doubts about that. In terms of circumstantial evidence, however, many of the so-called early church fathers or church historians attest in their writings that at least one of the apostolic books was originally penned in Hebrew. Of this, historian and chronologer Michael Rood, in his Chronology of the Gospels, writes the following: Pantanaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Cyril, Epiphanius, Eusebius, Irenaeus, Origen, and Jerome, early church historians of the 2nd to 4th centuries, all concurred with the statement of Papias, Yochanan's disciple, that Matthew wrote his gospel in the Hebrew language. Let me say that again. Let me read that quote again. Yochanan's disciple, that, quote, Matthew wrote his gospel in the Hebrew language, and several did their best to translate it, end quote. This is from the Ecclesiastical History, chapter 3, verses 39, written by Eusebius. This is attested by these church historians, the so-called church fathers, the early church fathers, said it's written in Hebrew, but yet nobody wants to bring that up. It's got to be Greek. It's got to be Greek. Well, turns out that over the last couple centuries, copies of Hebrew Matthew and other apostolic writings, such as the books of James and Revelation, have been discovered, studied, translated, and made available to the general public on a limited basis. And as time passes, more and more his Hebrew apostolic writings are showing up, even of entire covenant, New Covenant books, the whole New Testament. Now, this doesn't directly prove the ancient church historians' claims about Matthew writing his gospel account in his native Hebrew tongue. Certainly, these recovered Hebrew scripts are not originals, but are copies of copies of copies of an original. Just like their supposed Greek counterparts, presumably of the original Hebrew text. But what these writings bring to the forefront of modern biblical studies are eye-opening variations of the gospel record that differ in many places from their Greek counterpart. And the genealogy of Master Yeshua is an example of such a variation, beloved. It turns out that the ancient Hebrew Matthew, Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew, reveals that Matthew recorded for his readers not her husband Joseph's genealogy, but rather Miriam's genealogy. And just so we're on the same page and we're clear with one another, so to speak, we won't venture any further into the validity of Hebrew Gospels. It's a rabbi hole that would take us off course in our discussion of Melchizedek, and I don't want to muddy the waters on this topic any further than I've already done. But I will kind of bring this whole thing to some conclusion, this whole Hebrew Matthew genealogy of Yeshua to some semblance of conclusion. But the Apostle Matthew, being a first century Israeli Jew, would have understood the nuance that one's Hebrew or Jewish lineage could, in certain circumstances, be established through their mother's Hebrew or Jewish lineage. And this is the case that we find established here in the Hebrew Matthew, where Yeshua is not identified as Miriam's husband, but rather there is a Yosef who is identified as Miriam's biological father. Yosef Avi Miriam. Yosef Avi Miriam, or rather, Yosef, father of Miriam. Chapter 1, verse 16. This of Shem Tov's Hebrew Matthew. Yosef, father of Miriam. It is only through this rendering that Yeshua's written pedigree makes sense, and that it is affirmed. You can't stop the Father's word. It's going to get out. It's going to accomplish its purpose in the end. It always will. For Yeshua could not have qualified to sit on the throne of David through David's son Nathan 1. Solomon, however, became the successor of his father David, rightful heir to the throne. Consequently, Luke's genealogy shows Yeshua's stepfather is descended from David, but because Joseph descended from Nathan, Joseph is not a qualified royal. And the Joseph mentioned in Matthew's genealogy, who was directly linked to Yehoshua HaMashiach, is not Joseph, Miriam's betrothed husband and Yeshua's stepdad, but instead is Miriam's biological father. It should be understood, beloved, that Joseph was and remains a common name among our Hebrew Jewish cousins. This being the case, Yeshua most certainly qualified, biologically speaking, to inherit the throne of his forefather David through the Hebrew lineage of his biological mother, Mary or Miriam. But that's not all, beloved. We find recorded in Luke. Luke chapter 1. Let's look at verse 30 through 33. And it reads, the ISR, the scriptures read, and the messenger, that being Gabriel or Gabriel, said to her, her being Miriam or Mary, do not be afraid, Miriam, for you have found favor with Elohim. Verse 31. And see, you shall conceive in your womb and shall give birth to a son and call his name Yehoshua. Verse 32. He shall be great and shall be called the Son of the Most High. And Jehovah Elohim shall give him the throne of his father David, or David, verse 33. And he shall reign over the house of Jacob, or Jacob, forever, and there shall be no end to his reign. Hallelujah, hallelujah. So, despite any biological concerns regarding Yeshua's legitimacy to ascend to the throne of his forefather David, the master's receipt of David's throne would ultimately come down to the master's father, Jehovah, giving him the throne. Chapter 1, verse 32. There really is no other certification needed beyond that, is there? Now, circling back to this Hebrew Matthew passage then, it's impossible to truly pin down why the disparity between the Greek manuscript and the Hebrew manuscript renderings. Either an intentional scribal error caused the misleading rendering of Yeshua's royal pedigree in the Greek-based manuscript of Matthew chapter 1, verse 16, whereby Yeshua weakly qualifies to sit on David's throne through his stepfather Joseph's Davidic genealogy, or there was an unintentional mistranslation or misinterpretation of the original Greek text that might have properly reflected Yeshua's Davidic pedigree through his biological mother, Miriam or Mary. This error, regardless of whose fault it was, has been somewhat of a thorn in the sides of evangelists seeking to evangelize our Jewish cousins, as I mentioned previously. Many of our Jewish cousins would have easily picked up on the Joseph genealogy snafu. Matthew, in his genealogy, violates Jewish tradition by introducing to Yeshua's Davidic lineage 4 women, all of whom were non-Hebrew: Tamar, Rahab, Bathsheba, and Ruth. Clearly, the inclusion or introduction of these non-Hebrew women, dare I refer to them as matriarchs, into our master's royal lineage and pedigree bears wide spiritual implications that should not be overlooked or downplayed. The advent of Mashiach into this corrupt world, even through these non-Hebrew women, shows that Yah was intent on redeeming all categories of humanity: Jew, Gentile, men, women, slave, and free, Galatians chapter 3, verse 28, and in grafting them all into the commonwealth of Yasharal, or Yisrael, Romans chapter 11. Now let's look at Yeshua not biologically qualified for Levitical priesthood. Yeshua would not have qualified pedigree-wise, genealogically, biologically, as a priest, at least not from a Levitical standpoint or perspective. This reality, in my humble opinion, eliminates any such presumption of some kind of merging of the Melchizedekian and Levitical orders as insinuated by Dr. Ken Johnson in his book on Melchizedek, assuming Yehoshua is or was the next Melchizedek in the sequence of human history. Ken Johnson, in his book on Melchizedek, suggests that the Melchizedekian order took on a third office within Israel's spiritual structure, that of prophecy. And prophecy, of course, would be a fundamental aspect of the Melchizedekian school of prophecy, as mentioned in certain Jewish apocryphal literature. Recall in previous discussions, we looked at the apocryphal folklore where Abraham's Melchizedek was identified as Shem, Noah or Noach's righteous son. And it was Noah and Shem who ran the school of prophecy. But the school of prophecy ultimately ended around the time of Jacob or Jacob. And with the school's closure, consequently, the Melchizedekian order would seem to have merged with the Levitical order over in Israel territory. Now, I don't buy into this storyline, this merging. Seems clear to me that the Melchizedekian order had nothing to do with Israel and her Levitical priesthood other than the interaction and engagement between Avram and the Melchizedek back in Genesis chapter 14. The Melchizedekian order superseded the nation of Abraham, or I should say the person of Abraham, or the nation Abraham the nation that would proceed, let's say, from Abraham. However, we know that the Melchizedekian royal priestly order points squarely to the person and ministries of Yeshua. Hebrews chapter 5, verses 6 through 10, Hebrews chapter 6, verse 20, and Hebrews chapter 7, verses 1 through 17. And we will see that maybe the Melchizedekian order also touched upon the person and ministry of John, Yochanan the Mercer, and some of that is also kind of pointing to one of the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts entitled 11Q Melchizedek, 11Q Melchizedek. And so with this refocusing, we can safely conclude that the Melchizedek-Israel connection may not be based on a merging of two priestly orders, that of the Melchizedekian and the Levitical, but most likely the Melchizedekian order was a nascent, a very young priestly order that would germinate and come to its fullness or greatest potential through the prophet. The prophet, as noted in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 18, and exalted one, Yeshua HaMashiach, seated at the right hand of the Most High. So the question is there a John the Immerser or John the Baptist, Qumran, Melchizedek connection? The Melchizedekian theme appears to have been adopted and strongly maintained by the sons of Zadok, conceivably the Essenes and or members of the Qumran community of the Dead Sea Scrolls fame. And all indications are that Yochanan the Immerser was a member of the Qumran community. John's preaching and teachings and water immersions reflect the tenor or the apocalyptic tone common to various Dead Sea Scroll writings. This Qumran John or Yochanan connection is not too difficult a concept to wrap one's head around if they will let go of some of the traditional views of Yeshua's cousin. Is it just a coincidence, for instance, that Yochanan's water immersions were conducted just a few miles from the Qumran community proper? Speaking of water immersions, the Dead Sea Scrolls describe a community where many of her members ritually immersed themselves daily as a physical means for maintaining for themselves ritual purity. And this is referenced in the community rules, Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript 1QS. Indeed, archaeologists have uncovered several mikvaot, mikvah pools where people went to be mikvahed, immersed in water for ritual purity. Well, archaeologists have uncovered several mikvaot at the Qumran site. Here's another interesting tidbit that sort of helps strengthen the potential link between Yochanan, the immerser, and the Qumran community. According to Dead Sea Scroll, the community rules, or 1QS manuscript, either a member or members of their community would someday fulfill Isaiah chapter 40, verses 3 through 5, by walking in the community's halakha, separating themselves from the corrupt ones beyond their community, and dwell in the desert. This is Community Rule 1QS column 8, which reads, when these join the community in Israel and comply with the community rules, that take on Qumran community's halakha, they walk according to the ways of the Qumran community, they are to separate themselves from the men of sin and dwell in the desert in order to open his being the Messiah's path. As it is written, the voice crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of Jehovah. Make a straight highway in the desert for our God. Is this prophetically fingering Yochanan the Immerser, John the Baptist here in the community rules as the forerunner of Mashiach, of Messiah, hailing from their desert community? Separated from the corruption of Jerusalem and the world, as the voice of the one or ones crying in the wilderness? He who would be tasked with making straight in the desert a highway for Yah, for our master? I think it could very well have been. But Scripture tells us it was not the community's document that pinned, or this document 1QS, that pinned Yochanan as the one who fulfilled that prophecy of Isaiah, but more so it was Yochanan himself. He identified himself as that voice crying out in the wilderness, preparing the way of the master. John chapter 1, verse 19. Now this is the witness of Yochanan when the Yehudim, aka the Jewish religious leaders, sent from Jerusalem priests, probably Sadducees, and Levites to ask him, who are you? Verse 20. And he confessed and did not deny, but confessed, I am not the Messiah. Verse 21. And they asked him, what then? Are you Eliyahu? That is, are you Elijah? Although the immerser came in the spirit of Elijah, as mentioned in Luke chapter 1, verse 17. So John said, I am not. Then they ask him, are you the prophet? That is, as spoken of by Moshe in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 18. And John, answered, no, no. Verse 22, therefore they said to him, who are you? So that we give an answer to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? Verse 23, and this is the kicker here. He said, I am a voice of one crying in the wilderness. Make straight the way of Jehovah. And this is, of course, taken from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3. The Qumran community mindset was pretty much limited to an us versus them mentality. The us should be clear to all of us. But the them would be 1, the corrupt Jerusalem temple system, 2, their Jewish brethren who were of the various other Jewish sects throughout Judea, and 3, the occupying Roman government and its military. And this us versus them mentality was so ingrained in their psyche and in their day-to-day sectarian way of life that it can be viewed as though the community saw themselves almost as victims. As these saw it, the community was being forced to flee their covenant home and dwell in exile out in the wilderness, victims of a corrupt Jewish social and religious society that refused to walk steadfastly and unwaveringly in the ways of not just Jehovah, but more so in the established ways of the Qumran community leaders. These believed that they were ordained by Yah to pick up where the Jerusalem religious establishment or the Jewish religious system had terribly failed. These believed that their way was the only way to salvation. In his book, Ancient Order of Melchizedek, Dr. Ken Johnson wrote of a John the Immerser Qumran connection that goes beyond John's self-identification to his Jerusalem interrogators as a voice crying in the wilderness, making straight the way of the Master. And before going into what this next level connection might be or look like, I want to say that, like many other aspects of Dr. Johnson's research on Melchizedek, I don't buy into this one we're about to discuss either. I only mention it here because of the Qumran community's deep affinity and respect for Melchizedek and all the prophetic and spiritual elements that are attached to the Melchizedek Qumran John the Baptist or John the Immerser connection. And we'll get into some of what those elements appear to be in just a few. Now, this additional level of inference as it relates to a supposed Melchizedek Qumran John connection that Ken Johnson discusses in his book has to do with the immerser's sacred pedigree and the alleged sacred pedigree of many of the Qumran community members. Recall that many of the Qumran community members are believed by some to have been self-exiled priests. Specifically, these are believed to have been Zadokite priests. Members of the community refer to themselves as the sons of Zadok. Also recall that we touched upon the Zadokim Dead Sea Scroll Qumran connection in a previous installment of this series. I believe it was the last installment, part 4. So enter into this discussion John or Yochanan the Immerser, of whom certain traditions identify as a member of the Qumran community. So what proof, apart from circumstantial evidence, do we have that John was a member of the Qumran community? Well, in order to establish that evidence, we must first go back to his birth and early childhood. Here are key historical truths about Yochanan's pre-Baptist or pre-water immersion life. One, the first being Yochanan's parents. Zechariah and Elisheva or Elizabeth were descendants of the Levitical priestly order. In fact, 9 months prior to Yochanan's birth, Zechariah was conducting his priestly duties at the Jerusalem temple. He was of the course of Aviah, as mentioned in Luke chapter 1, verse 5. You see, David, before his death, organized the Levitical priestly order into 24 courses or 24 service divisions to minister more efficiently to the people and to maintain the Jerusalem temple worship operations. And this is documented in 1 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 1 through 18. And so at this time in our storyline, it would have been close to Shavuot or Pentecost. And Zechariah's Aviah order would have been ministering to the throngs of worshipers who'd come up to Jerusalem or Yerushalayim for this second of 3 annual pilgrimage feast of Yah for that year. It should also be mentioned that Yochanan's mom, Elisheva or Elizabeth, was a descendant of Aharon or Aaron, the first high priest. And as a couple, Luke describes them as being righteous and walked blamelessly in all the commandments and ordinances of Yah. Luke chapter 1, verse 6. The second thing is that Zechariah and Elisheva were both up in age, and they were considered, at least in that era of human history, beyond normal childbearing years. So while conducting his ministerial duties at the temple, again, possibly during Shavuot or Pentecost, a busy time for the Aviah course that year, Zechariah has an up-close and personal encounter with the messenger, again, the messenger Gabriel or Gabriel. And Gabriel informs Zechariah that he would have a son through his barren wife Elisheva or Elizabeth. And he instructs Zechariah to name his son Yochanan, John. Luke chapter 1, verses 8 through 13. Third, Gabriel prophesies to Zechariah that his son, Yochanan, would, 1, bring great joy to many in the nation. 2, be great in Yah's eyes. Abstain from consuming alcohol his entire life. Be filled with Yah's spirit, even from his time in his mother Elishave's womb. 5, usher in a time of teshuvah among his people, Yisrael. 6, possess the character traits of the great prophet Eliyahu, or Elijah, such that the hearts of the fathers would be turned to their children. 7, make righteousness, once again, a desirable thing to seek after among his people. And 8, prepare the people of Yisrael to receive their long-awaited king. All of this in Luke chapter 1, verses 14 through 17. Fourth thing, shortly afterward, Elisheva was conceived of Yochanan, her son, and she was led by the Holy Spirit to quarantine herself away from her people during much of her pregnancy. Luke chapter 1, verses 24 and 25. The fifth thing, 9 months later, about the time of the pilgrimage feast of unleavened bread. Isn't it interesting how these great events happen during the feast of Yah? But I digress. So it's about the time of the feast of unleavened bread, 9 months after Yochanan was conceived, that Elisheva delivered and brought forth John, Yochanan. Luke chapter 1, verses 57 and 58. 6, on his 8th day, in keeping with Torah, Yochanan's parents had him circumcised, tongue-tied. And at that ceremony, his father, Zechariah, as instructed by Yah, named him Yochanan, or John. Luke chapter 1, verses 59 through 63. 7, 11 months later, Herod the Great orders the execution of all children living in Bethlehem, or Bethlehem, and the surrounding towns, ages 2 years and younger. Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. 8. From this point in Yochanan's young life, and the time frame leading up to his debut on the banks of the Jordan, water immersing his disciples, Luke only records these 2 things about Yochanan. The first, Luke chapter 1, verse 80. And the child grew and became strong in spirit, and was in the deserts until the day of showing himself openly to Yisrael. Then Luke chapter 3, verse 2. Annas and Caiaphas being the high priest, the word of God came unto John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. So the multi-billion-dollar question demanding an answer here is, how and why did this man, whom Yeshua declared to be the greatest prophet ever to be born of women, Luke chapter 7, verse 28, end up in the wilderness where he is said to have received the word of Yah? Unfortunately, the canonical gospel records are silent on this question. However, there is an extra biblical record that answers this critical question. 9, we find in the 16th chapter of a 2nd century CE writing called the Proto-Evangelium of James, also known as the Gospel of James, the following account of John and his parents. And this is the Proto-Evangelium of James, chapter 16, looking at verse 1. Then Herod, perceiving that he was mocked by the wise men, remember the wise men that came to see Yeshua? Well, Herod felt that he was being mocked by these wise men, and then being very angry, continuing, commanded certain men to go and to kill all the children that were in Bethlehem from 2 years old and under. Verse 2, but Mary, hearing that the children were being killed, being under much fear, took the child, Yeshua, wrapped him up in swaddling clothes, and laid him in an ox manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Verse 3, Elizabeth, also hearing that her son John was about to be searched for, took him and went up into the mountains and looked around for a place to hide him. Verse 4, and there was no secret place to be found. Verse 5, then she groaned within herself and said, O mountain of the Lord, receive the mother with the child. Verse 6, for Elizabeth could not climb up. Verse 7, and instantly the mountain was divided and received them. Verse 8, and there appeared to them an angel of the Lord to preserve them. Indeed, this seems to describe sort of the location of Qumran in the wilderness, surrounded by difficult-to-climb mountains. Is it not reasonable to conclude that Yah led Elizabeth to take her and her son, her young son, to a secluded place in the wilderness where he would be protected, fed, nourished, and receive the word of Yah for 27 years of his life? Verse 9, continuing, but Herod made search for John and sent servants to Zacharias when he was ministering at the altar at the temple, and said unto him, where hast thou hid thy son? Verse 10, he replied to them, I am a minister of God and a servant at the altar. How should I know where my son is? Verse 11, so the servants went back and told Herod the whole, at which he was incensed and said, is not this one of his like to be king of Israel? Is not this one of his like to be king of Israel? Talking about, is not this John, his son, supposed to be pegged to be king of Israel? So he's getting it kind of confused, John confused with Yeshua. But that's how things go in the fog of carnage and chaos that was surrounding Israel at this time. Continuing, verse 12, he sent therefore again his servants to Zacharias, saying, tell us the truth. Where is thy son? For you know that your life is in my hand. He's threatening Zechariah. Verse 13, so the servants went and told him all this. Verse 14, but Zacharias replied to them, I am a martyr for God. He knows what's about to happen. And if ye shed my blood, the Lord will receive my soul. Verse 15, besides, you know ye shed innocent blood. Verse 16, however, Zacharias was murdered in the entrance of the temple, said altar, and about the partition. So we have Yochanan conceivably calling Qumran his home base because of a direct threat to his life by Herod's henchmen. And this situation would have exposed him to austere living conditions, such as his diet and his clothing and how he conducted himself around others. Now, assuming he was a member of the Qumran community, he would have been exposed to an intense and disciplined learning environment. It is conceivable that the supposed resident Zadok Priestly Order, alluded to earlier, recognized Yochanan's priestly pedigree and inducted him into their order. Again, possibly. I'm not going to die on this hill. Now, this is all circumstantial at best, but it certainly makes more sense to me than the prior talk about a merged priesthood. That is the Levitical with the Melchizedekian, and a mysterious school of prophecy where Shem sat as the school's dean, so to speak. And I've always thought there might be a connection or a link between Yochanan the Immerser or John the Baptist and the Qumran Essene community because of their proximity to each other, along with Yochanan's austere demeanor and appearance and Yochanan's fiery wrath, judgment, and brimstone declarations to the Jerusalem religious leaders who came out to see him. But you're probably wondering what any of what we've just discussed has to do with Melchizedek and the Melchizedekian order. Well, quite a bit, actually, and we'll get into it shortly. Let's talk about Yochanan's baptism or immersion of Yehoshua and what purpose it served. Dr. Ken Johnson, in his book on Melchizedek, takes John's story on a trajectory that, prior to me reading his book, I'd never considered before. The age-old debate as to why a sinless Yeshua would come to his cousin Yochanan or John to be water immersed or baptized has gone insufficiently unanswered for centuries. Yes, countless Christian teachers and students of the Bible have tackled and struggled to interpret the Master's response to Yochanan's hesitancy to baptize him. Matthew chapter 3, verse 14. John says to Yeshua, I need to be immersed by you, and you come to me? The immerser says to the Master, and that heavy response that the Master makes to Yochanan's hesitancy, he says to John, permit it now. For thus it is fitting for us to fill all righteousness. And I think this has never been satisfactorily explained or interpreted or even accepted by the body of Messiah as an understanding of what it means. What are some of the common explanations? Well, David Stern, in the Jewish New Testament commentary, simply reiterates or reminds his readers what other commentators have concluded about the Master's statement. Quote, that Yeshua was simply identifying with sinful humanity who did not need purification, end quote. You know, I've never been satisfied with this explanation of Yeshua's declaration to his cousin Yochanan. Then we have John D. Berry, suggests Yeshua was, quote, publicly identifying with God's kingdom through his baptism, end quote. And this comes out of Faith Life Study Bible commentary. Then we have the New Living Translation explanation of Yeshua's actions and statement to Yochanan was the Master's intent to fulfill that which Torah requires of all who come to faith. To fulfill the yoke of Torah is to be righteous, to engage in actionable righteousness, if you will. Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. Matthew chapter 6, verse 1 and verse 33, and Matthew chapter 21, verse 32. Our actionable righteousness, as opposed to our imputed righteousness, cannot save us. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9. Only our faith in Yeshua's person and ministry and Yah's imputed grace and righteousness can save us. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. Romans chapter 4, verse 11 and verse 22, and James chapter 2, verse 23. But, unless we behave righteously, as Yah requires, that is, righteousness that comes from walking in Torah and following Yeshua's teachings and example, we, quote, will never enter the Malkut Shamayim, the kingdom of the heavens, end quote. Revelation chapter 21, verse 27. Thus, Yeshua instructed us, his taught ones, to make it our priority in life to seek after and walk out Abba Yah's reign over our lives, which requires us to walk in his righteous ways. Craig L. Bloomberg, in an article he wrote for the New American Commentary, offers what I've always considered being the best answer to the question we're attempting to answer here. He writes, quote, to fulfill all righteousness means to complete everything that forms part of a relationship of obedience to God, to Yah. In other words, Yeshua in his coming to Yochanan to be water immersed wasn't coming to him to confess his sins and to teshuvah like the other disciples who came to him. Yehoshua was the spotless, unblemished Lamb of Yah, which taketh away the sin of the world. John chapter 1, verse 29 and verse 36. Yeshua was sinless. But rather, Yeshua came to Yochanan, his cousin John, for water immersion to, one, ensure that he had done all that was required of those who walk in Yah's Torah and enter the body of Messiah, And 2, he was by example endorsing his cousin's ministry that demanded his people teshuvah, return to Torah and to the covenant relationship Yah cut with them at the beginning of their nation's history, and submit themselves to obedience to Yah's words and to water immersion. Yeshua knew you can't expect one's disciples to do something that you are refusing to do. If he didn't get baptized, people would say, well, if he didn't do it, then why should I? So, in this manner, Yeshua was in part fulfilling all righteousness, doing what was necessary to establish the new faith, the true faith once what's delivered. Yeshua's submission to such things would tell the world that what he and John were doing in their ministries was the right thing to do in order to receive the kingdom and to be saved. And of course, there are many more explanations or interpretations of this passage that biblical thinkers and interpreters have proffered over the years. But Ken Johnson, he offers probably the most shocking explanation of any I've come across in all my years in this beloved faith. Johnson's explanation circles back to Qumran and its history, along with the presumption of John or Yochanan being a member of the Qumran community in some uncertain, unverifiable capacity. Be that capacity as him being just a devout citizen or member of the Qumran community and a refuge of Herod's attempts on his life, or as a member of the community's resident priesthood, especially given that genealogically, Yochanan was qualified to be a priest according to Torah. But rather, Johnson contends that Yeshua's insistence that all righteousness needed to be fulfilled by way of him being water immersed by his cousin Yochanan or John, because in so doing, he would be immersed into the priesthood by a legitimate priest of Yah. This act would spiritually open the door, according to Johnson, to Yehoshua, quote, reestablishing the Melchizedekian priesthood, which would make it possible for him to fulfill all righteousness, end quote. And this is page 54 of his book on Melchizedek. Johnson further contends that Yochanan was an Essene, which I assume also made him a son of Zadok, a Zadokite priest even, according to Qumran sectarian folklore and worldview. Consequently, according to Johnson, Yochanan had somehow received leadership of the defunct school of the prophets. How? Why? Johnson does not say, but supposedly these two credentials made John the only human alive at that time to baptize Yeshua and to baptize him into the priesthood, conceivably the Melchizedekian priesthood. He doesn't say. I'm assuming it was the Melchizedekian priesthood. He couldn't, we'll get into what Dr. Johnson's attention-grabbing explanation for why Yeshua had his cousin Yochanan baptize or water immerse him, that is, Yochanan, a priest, maybe even of the Zadokite or Melchizedekian order, let's say, into the Melchizedekian Priestly Order, was initially, it still is shocking to me, and that the author provided no references to support his claim made me wonder how he truly arrived at this claim. You see, for me, his fantastical claims that he mentions here stir up a lot of unanswered questions. Since when can an individual be baptized or water immersed into a priesthood, much less the Levitical priesthood or even the Melchizedekian priesthood? Where do we get that from? Secondly, how would Yeshua being baptized into said priesthood fulfill all righteousness. 3, isn't the spiritual purpose and meaning behind water immersion that Yochanan brought lost here? If this was the real reason that he baptized? 4, Yochanan was of the Levitical priestly line, with his mother being a direct descendant of Aharon, Luke chapter 1, verse 5. Yehoshua was descended from the royal Davidic line, of which the two lines were never to cross the other, Exodus chapter 32. Now this, according to the original covenant and Torah. Therefore, Yochanan had no authority to confer upon his cousin Yeshua a Levitical priestly line. You see, Yochanan should and would have known that. And for Yochanan and Yehoshua to even think they could get away with pulling off such a thing would be dangerously close to both of them outright defying the will and ways of Yah. So I don't see how any of this could actually work, according to Dr. Johnson's theory. Now, having vented out my outrage and confusion over such a claim, I will concede the following in Dr. Johnson's direction. Outside of Yah's Torah, there would be nothing prohibiting Yah from conferring upon his son, which we will discuss in the next few installments to this series, a priestly office, even a high priestly office over the Melchizedekian order. Yah has, in fact, already done such a thing as noted in Psalm chapter 110. Not only did Yah make his son a priest, but the high priest of the Melchizedekian order. For the Melchizedekian order, as we've previously discussed, preceded, superseded, and was separate from that of its Levitical counterpart. And this is why I doubt seriously the many claims Dr. Ken Johnson makes in his book about the Melchizedekian order and its attachments to our faith and our faith's patriarchs. And let's be clear about these two separate priestly orders. The Levitical priesthood is presently shelved. It temporarily went the way of the temple in the years 68 through 70 CE. And although there is little in the way of scholarly or archaeological support, many believe that the Zadokite priesthood, at least a remnant of that sect of the Levitical priestly order, was driven into exile, believed to have maybe taken up residence in Qumran right about the time the Hasmoneans took over the whole social and worship system of Israel in the 2nd or so century BCE, about that time. What we have, however, are various Dead Sea Scroll writings that refer to Qumran community members conceivably being the sons of Zadok. But scholars are divided as to what actually happened to the Zadokite priestly order. Some of these scholars go so far as to suggest that the Zadokite priestly order ultimately diminished into an idealistic priestly order that was absorbed into the Qumran community's identity without there being a single Zadokite priest in attendance, since the biological descendants of the high priest Zadok had sadly faded away in terms of their ecclesiastical power, their influence, and their leadership within the commonwealth of Yisrael's worship system. And I believe that a remnant of Zadokite priests did part company with the Jerusalem religious establishment, and maybe they set up residence in Qumran. I don't think it's beyond the realm of I think it is beyond the realm of impossibility. I think they absolutely did. And much of that parting of the ways took place because of the political religious reconfiguration that occurred after the Maccabean revolt. You see, with the Maccabean revolt over her Greek Macedonian enemies, emerged the Hasmonean political and religious order that sidelined the once powerful and spiritually influential Zadokite priesthood. And some scholars suggest that the Hasmoneans completely reconfigured the original Levitical priesthood such that the rigid lines that once defined who qualified and who did not qualify to be a priest especially of the Zadokite caliber, well, they became blurred. This and other actions taken by the Hasmoneans all but drove, I believe, and other scholars believe, the Zadokite priesthood or priestly order underground and or into self-exile in places like Qumran. They didn't all go to Qumran. Some of them went elsewhere. But our focus is the Qumran connection here to the Melchizedekian discussion. The Zadokite priestly order, although extinguished from much of the Second Temple worship system, was still held in high esteem in the hearts and the minds of many devout Jews of that era. The Zadokite priesthood became legendary in many respects, especially as the corruption of the Jerusalem leadership and the worship system became more apparent to the people. Obviously, among the more pious or devout, the legendary Zadokite priesthood became spiritually linked in various ways to the mysterious figure Melchizedek. This supposed linkage in some ways makes sense, given that the Zadokites during that time were mostly physically non-existent, but possibly some were still ministering in absentia in Qumran. The members of the Qumran community who called themselves either to bolster their spiritual identity or because they were actually sons of Zadok, revered Melchizedek, believing him to be an exalted, a heavenly being who would someday restore Yisrael to her former glory and usher in an era of judgment upon the community's enemies. And clearly the Qumran community members, be they a true remnant of the sons of Zadok or just devout Jews who separated themselves from the corrupt world around them, identified the Melchizedek as the prophesied Messiah, the Mashiach. And we'll get into this aspect of the Melchizedek story in the next installment of our series. So, in closing, to answer the question posed in the title to this post, I do not believe Yochanan or John baptized or immersed Yehoshua Messiah into any priesthood, be it the Levitical or be it the Melchizedekian. Yochanan's baptism of his cousin Yeshua was to fulfill the righteousness of the ministry that the two of them had embarked upon, which would establish the foundation of the true faith once delivered, the body of Messiah. Yeshua being inducted into a priesthood, as we will see in the next few installments of this series, our master's high priestly office was conferred upon him by his father, Yehovah, from the foundation of this world, Psalm 110. And his Melchizedekian pedigree was baked in, if you will, to his messiahship, his sonship. And we as his faithful followers will fulfill that call of Father to be a royal kingdom of priests unto him, headed by our illustrious master, Yehoshua Messiah. Exodus chapter 19, verse 6, Revelation chapter 1, verse 6, and Revelation chapter 5, verse 10. And with that, we'll bring this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer to a close and bring this installment of our Melchizedek series to a close, heading into part 6 at some point, which brings me to the topic at hand. As I mentioned in the last post we did last week, I had mentioned that I probably will not be posting as frequently, as weekly as I had been or have been over this last year. We are about to engage in some extensive travel over the course of the next 3 months, and I don't know the logistics will make posting content even possible for me. I'm going to try to see what I can do to keep that. I have more than enough content, believe me. It's just a matter of putting out a decent quality audio post, but we'll see how that goes. But for now, I know that we'll be on the road quite a bit. Most of it will be out of country, and so getting my hands on infrastructure to allow me to do that may be a little challenging, but I'm gonna leave it in Father's hands. So what is the bottom line? Don't expect a post every week. Don't expect a post even worse in the next 2 or 3 months. It just depends what Father does. And so I will be thinking about you guys until I can't wait to get back and resume the posting on a weekly basis, because I do love doing this. And I really appreciate your listenership and your readership. And I would covet your prayers as we go about engaging in ministry on the road. And that's what we're about to be doing. It's not a vacation. We've got some personal things that we need to take care of, which is probably about 1/5 of what we need to do, but the other 4/5 are ministry related. So we're actually going to get out of our chairs, out of our house, and actually go about doing ministry work out in the field. Work while it is still day, because the night cometh when no man can work. So keep us in your prayers. And I bid you Shabbat Shalom for the rest of you who are still having some hours left in your Sabbath. Shavua Tov as we go into a new week filled with opportunities to serve Yahovah and the kingdom. And I bid you take care until next time. Take care.